welcome to tonight's edition of the Evening Review. My name is Toyo Njebela, your host for tonight. Let's first look at today's front page of Namibian Sun. Today, the ministers and deputy ministers took oath of office at State House, and here is what some of them had to say, speaking to our colleague Jemima Biggers.
The natural resources of Namibia belong to Namibians, and I'm happy to say in the fishery sector, the majority of shareholders, overwhelming majority, are Namibian citizens. And I want to make sure that the record is kept. Because these resources must benefit Namibians first and foremost, must benefit our women, our mothers first and foremost, must benefit the youth first and foremost, must contribute to the development of this country first and foremost, must contribute to the policy of industrialization, meaning setting factories on shore so that we create more employment.
Yeah, okay, just for clarity, are you, because initially you were told us that the quotas will be awarded this month. Is that still going to continue, or are you backtracking, or you are still waiting for cabinet decision on the way forward?
You see, my friend, as I said, on that one now, I have to get the guidance from cabinet, and then we move.
So the process
we are going to make a what we call a public statement once the cabinet has pronounced itself.
I thought it was a very important task that he's bestowing upon me. A task that I do not carry myself, but also carry the hopes and dreams of all Namibian youth on my shoulders. But I took heart and I thought, I take up this challenge. I've taken up challenges before as a youth leader, and I think this is no different. As long as I have the support and the guidance, I don't think I'll go wrong. And I will bank on the experience so far I've had, but also be willing to take advice and guidance from those that have been there. In high school, I was the junior mayor of the city of Windhoek. I served as Deputy Speaker of the Children's Parliament of the Republic of Namibia. I also served in NANSO in various capacities, in which the last one I served last year before the last Congress. And I've worked with various groups, youth groups. I've worked with AFRIAN, that I still do today, Global Shapers, Windhoek, and so on, really. It's that in a nutshell, yes. Of course, as you know, MICT has a very important role to disseminate programs of government. Of course, that would need to be improved so people know exactly what government is playing, the role it's playing in improving their lives. But also, secondly, the ministry starts with many bills that are yet to be tabled, and those bills including access to information, which is very important. We also have the cyber bill that's also pertinent, and so on. So all of those, of course, would need to move forward because as a nation, as you know, access to information is important. It allows one to practice their God-given and human rights if they're able to be informed about them and what.
Selective reporting, because corruption is everywhere. But of course, it doesn't justify, you see, that corruption should be entertained in the defense force. So we'll do everything to our best to make sure that corruption is, if wherever it appears, is fought and then eradicated, not to go on the street. But you should remember that in the economy, there are a lot of participants in the economy. There are private companies also which have closed doors and people have gone in the street. Yeah, as much as we try to make sure you see that our people don't go on the street, some of this will be inevitable. So I cannot really guarantee that nobody will go on the street, but we'll strive our best to make sure that nobody goes on the street.
In tonight's segment of the interviews, we are joined by Graham Hopwood, the Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research, to talk to us about the new cabinet that has just been announced yesterday, as a matter of fact. Graham, thank you for coming.
Okay, great. Good to be here.
Yeah. What was your general initial reaction to the appointments?
I think initially relatively positive, because I think there was two sort of themes. One was the promotion of gender equality and the move towards 50-50, which is quite obvious in a lot of the appointments, and then the inclusion of youth, which I think particularly I would say in the appointments of Emma Theophilus as a Deputy Minister of ICT,
yes,
and the new Minister of Justice, Yvonne Dowseb, was in a way a kind of PR coup.
Yes.
It took the attention away from some of the more difficult issues government is facing at the moment, and seemed positive and refreshing. And then I think the third sort of most significant was the fact that Kala Schleppwein was shifted from finance, and in comes Ipumbu Shimi, untested person, but somebody who has technical expertise from his years at the Bank of Namibia. But coming in at, possibly, I mean, I saw in the newspapers this morning, Kala Schleppwein was saying it's been a stressful almost five years of his life. Well, it's going to get worse, I'm afraid. And that's not because of anything. We had a difficult situation with the economy anyway, but now with the COVID-19 virus, it's going to get significantly more difficult to deal with that job.
Let's talk quickly about Ipumbu Shimi. So he is coming in without having served in a political space as such. So technically he's capable, I think. But do you need to have also some sort of political backbone to succeed in that portfolio? Absolutely.
I mean, I think one of the things you will have to do is to push back against constant demands from your colleagues in cabinet for spending. Every ministry wants to spend more than it inevitably gets at the end of the day. And then, you have all the sectors pushing on him, particularly I think the private sector, who are concerned about the state of the economy, want certain reforms to take place. And then he has also to deal with his boss, the president, as well. So it's a huge headache, I would say, that job at the moment. And whether he fully realizes the challenges, the best thing really would be if he could form a team with those other cabinet colleagues who deal with economic related issues, and maybe they could work together as a small team within cabinet, because we're going to have to come up with an economic plan. The president talked about an economic recovery plan relating to COVID-19, and that is going to have to be done pretty soon. So hopefully he won't be left alone, but he'll have the support of some of his colleagues in related positions that are also key for the economy.
What do you read into the shifting of Schleppwein? What is that? Because he was not effective at finance, or because the president thinks he will do better in his next portfolio?
I think there was a sense that he was, under a lot of pressure, and 5 years of consistent pressure to do with the recession and a host of related difficulties. I just suspect he needed a break, to be honest, and that it might not be a sign that he did a particularly bad job. He probably did a reasonable job in very difficult circumstances, but the fact that he hasn't been moved out of cabinet altogether means that he's, I think, still seen as a very useful minister, and he has a different set of challenges at agriculture and land reform. But that's an important portfolio. We've just had rain. Agriculture's potential is actually one of the bright spots at the moment. And then land reform has been a tricky issue. One hears a lot of reports of mismanagement and corruption within the lands ministry. So I think to some extent he might have been sent there to clean up as well.
And which brings me to my next question around land reform. Maybe it's a bit cynical of people to say this, but some of the initial reactions that we've seen today is a German guy driving land reform, and land is predominantly in the hands of the Germans. Does that count in favor of what we want to get, or will it be tricky for him?
Well, I think from the point of view that he seems to be one of those ministers who's taken a strong stance against corruption, I think it could be a good thing, because one of the things that's marred land reform is sort of favouritism in the allocation, for example, of resettlement farms. So I think people have maybe got to look at the bigger picture. The other thing you can say about Kalash Letvain is he's been a long time SWAPO member. He's never represented the conservative minority group in Namibia. So I don't see why he would act in their interests. I think he will hopefully make land reform more efficient, and that would benefit the beneficiaries and the people who want to see change in that area. So because he's stuck at the moment because we haven't implemented most of the land reform resolutions, so maybe his job will also be to do that.
Definitely. Now, Letvain is heading to a ministry that used to be headed by Alphonse Ngaruseb, and Ngaruseb and a few other senior ministers have not been retained, at least in the interim. We don't know whether there are plans by the president to redeploy them in some other capacities. But what is likely to happen to these ministers that they have not been mentioned?
Well, traditionally, SWAPO has always recycled people. So, you know, they end up being given another post somewhere, or often made into ambassadors. I hope in a way that doesn't happen. We've got to have a political culture where ministers don't expect to be housed somewhere in the political system for all of their lives and have to cope with what normal people have to cope with, is that sometimes you move on and do something else different, or you retire. You know, the only one that made me a bit sad in terms of those people who've now been left out was Stanley Samata, because I thought he was doing a reasonable job at ICT, and also civil society had worked with him quite well on access to information, and I don't think it's not his fault that bill has not yet appeared. So that seemed slightly counter to the general tone in the new cabinet, which is to move against people who are perceived as incompetent or potentially corrupt, and to keep the more efficient technocratic people in place. And
these ministers, there are a lot. Of course, you have your Erking Mtinas, your Charles Namolos, who did not make the list to Parliament.
Yeah.
But you have those who made it to Parliament but are not. They've been removed from these ministerial positions. What do you read into that? Is it a question of simply government evolving, or is it some sort of a message to say they did not perform well? What do you read into that?
I think it is evolving, and as the president said, maybe they didn't all do a terrible job, you know, but the reality was he had to move to a smaller cabinet. He'd promised that, and it does make sense. And also I think he has to acknowledge what happened in the election, which is that a large segment of the youth showed that they were not happy with government and not happy with his leadership. And therefore he had to respond to the youth by showing this at least some element of generational transition with younger people coming in. And I think that's what this reflects. So it's inevitable that some people within the patronage system of SWAPO will have to take a lesser role. Now, whether they are brought back in another capacity, we don't know. I'm not sure. There might still be special advisors in the presidency. And then there's a new investment board to be set up within the office of the president, which could also incorporate people. So I'm not clear that everyone is completely out. We've also lost a whole slew of deputy ministers, you know, and I hope that's a recognition, you know, that they weren't really contributing. So what's the point, you know? But we'll see.
But now also, if we get people redeployed in other capacities, because part of the strategy, according to what the president has been saying, why he's having a leaner cabinet now, was in part to deal with the wage bill. Now, if some of these guys are redeployed elsewhere, will that make a dent to the wage bill, as a matter of fact?
No, it undermines the argument, and already the argument isn't very strong, because actually the number of ministers we've ended up with is not too far below what we had before, although the number of ministries might be less. But we haven't talked about any ministries losing staff, which is it couldn't really be done at the moment because of the situation of the economy. So there isn't really a downsizing of government going on in any serious kind of way. But at least he can say symbolically, we've taken away a few salaries. He did say that the special advisors to the regional governors were going to go, so that's another set of advisors. a reduction in perks like the removal of the 4x4s. So, you know, if you take those together, there are some savings, but they're not actually significant to address this issue of the bloated civil service, which we're going to have to face at some point.
Definitely. You spoke about the youth earlier, Graham, and where you sort of hinted at an injection of a slow injection of youth into the system. And you spoke about Emma, the lady, the new Deputy Minister of ICT. But would it have been better if we actually had younger people in cabinet as opposed to deputy ministers who will be in parliament? There isn't enough influence in parliament as you would have in cabinet. Do you think that it would have been better to also have some good faces in the cabinet itself?
I think it would have been a bolder move, for example, to make her the Minister of Youth, which would have been or at least the Deputy Minister of Youth, but that would have been a more logical position. But one of my colleagues was saying this morning, but maybe she's put in there she's a very eloquent person, so she'll make good speeches in Parliament. And to counter those younger people in the LPM and PDM in particular who are now on the opposition benches, so that those younger people aren't simply seen to be attacking and criticising the older generation in SWAPO.
We have 5 ministries without deputy ministers: finance, justice, public enterprises, higher education and environment. And the president, when he announced his deputy ministers as a matter of fact, the ministries last week, he hinted at a situation where some ministries may actually be like this without deputy ministers. But are we likely to see maybe 2-3 more deputy ministers being appointed to fill some of these vacancies?
Possibly. I think there might be one or two more, but I think it's a good example to set to leave some vacant, particularly if the ministers say, look, I can manage, because often the function of a deputy minister is not clear, apart from maybe to go to events where the minister's not available and make a speech, and occasionally deputise for the minister, and I'm sure we can live without some of them.
Yeah. Countries like Zambia don't have deputy ministers at all. Has a country like that been affected by that scenario, that we don't have deputy ministers and therefore things are not moving, or is it something that countries must start actually considering?
Well, my view is that we don't really need many deputy ministers, but that money could be either saved or put into the ministries to get technocratic expertise near the top. So I don't mind if a minister has an advisor, if that advisor is really good and giving the minister good advice. So, you know, that might be far more useful than to spend that money on that role rather than having a deputy minister.
Yeah. The second last question, Graham, is around the 8 nominees of the president. Because that provision, technically speaking, really is to help the president, because you see, because people are going through processes of elections, the people who emerge out of these processes, like the electoral college or the elections as we had them in November last year, some of your most technically gifted people may not come out of the system. And my understanding, my limited understanding of this provision of nominating 8 people to parliament is to help bring in experts in certain areas. Did you see a reflection of that in the number of people, in the list of people that were appointed?
Yes, I did. I think he's given himself some options for the future there. There are some quite good people who will be backbenchers, I think, who are quite experienced in government and in regional government. And then he's obviously got Emma Theophilus there, the new Minister of Defence. So I think what he didn't do is bring people really from sort of outside, like the private sector. Some people thought there might be more innovative choices there, but I can see that he has tried to complement the skills base of cabinet by bringing in some extra people.
My last question to you, Graham, is the president today at the swearing in of the ministers spoke boldly about improved performance and how is there a wake-up call from the results of last year's elections, and therefore really wanted to push, and is it enough just to talk, or do we need to see certain actions being taken in order to show that indeed he has heeded the call of the people?
What worries me is that although it was kind of impressive taken on its own what he said, we've actually heard it all before in the first term of office, and somehow they weren't able to effect this better performance and improved delivery, despite having a performance management system. So what's different this time? So I think the president himself is going to have to sit down and think, well, how do I manage things? He's like the team manager, you know. And as you pointed out, the Sun pointed out last week, in their cabinet ratings, I think you only had a few people who were over sort of 50% performance. So, you know, the performance has been poor in general. And how is he going to turn that around? It's going to take a lot more than speeches. It's to do with his probably a lot more hands-on management and really getting behind his ministers and helping them where they do take the initiative to introduce reforms and important policies and actions.
Graham, thank you very much for coming.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
That was Graham Hopwood, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research, speaking to us about the new cabinet that had just been assembled by the President. I hope you enjoyed the interview like I did. Good night.